April 1945. The ruins of a bombed German town near Würzburg. Dust hangs heavy over a landscape of shattered brick, twisted steel, and cratered mud. A single, desperate figure breaks the silence of the wasteland. A woman digs through collapsed masonry with her bare hands, her fingers raw, bleeding, and caked in gray mortar. She has been tearing at the heavy stone blocks since the first light of dawn broke over the wreckage. An American military policeman steps forward, grabbing her arm to push her away from the clearing roadway. She screams, kicking and wrestling against his grip, refusing to abandon the pile of debris. Her shrieks echo through the empty streets, catching the attention of an approaching staff car. General George S. Patton will soon confront this raw display of civilian agony and force his own men to look beneath the uniform. This is the story of what Patton did when he found a German mother digging through rubble with bleeding hands. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Frau Elise Hoffmann was 49 years old, a native of Würzburg, and a woman who had already given everything to a conflict she never wanted. Her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front in the freezing winter of 1943, leaving her alone to raise their only remaining child. She spent her days working in a local bakery, watching the town crumble around her as the front line crept closer to her doorstep. When the Nazi regime grew desperate, they took her 17-year-old boy, dressed him in an oversized uniform, and placed a rifle in his soft hands. He was her entire world, the last piece of her shattered life, and she refused to let the falling bricks of a dying empire bury him forever. On that chaotic morning, she found herself clawing at the stone mountain that had swallowed her home, completely indifferent to the foreign armies marching past. Captain Arthur Vance was a 34-year-old engineering officer from Columbus, Ohio, serving with the 119th Armored Engineer Battalion. He was a veteran of the Normandy breakout, a man whose skin had been hardened by months of dust, exhaust fumes, and the constant threat of German artillery. Vance was highly efficient, strictly professional, and lived by the Army Field Manual, believing that clear lines kept soldiers alive in the chaos of occupation. He wore a clean, well-pressed field jacket and carried a silver-plated cigarette case in his breast pocket, a minor luxury he managed to keep immaculate despite the mud of the European theater. To Vance, the mission was simple: clear the roads, advance the armor, and treat every local civilian as a potential saboteur or a hostile distraction. He stood by the idling heavy machinery, looking at the hysterical local woman as a logistical obstacle that needed to be cleared immediately to keep the column moving. By April of 1945, the Allied advance into the heart of Germany had turned from a series of structured battles into a massive, sweeping mop-up operation. The German war machine was fracturing at every level, leaving behind a power vacuum filled with smoke, wandering refugees, and isolated pockets of resistance. American columns pushed forward night and day, eager to crush the remaining strongholds before the fast-approaching spring rains could turn the unpaved secondary roads into impassable bogs. Entire divisions moved with mechanical speed, bypassing burning forests and shattered rail hubs to maintain the momentum of the final push. In this environment, time was the most valuable asset, and any delay along the primary supply routes could jeopardize tactical operations miles ahead. The chaos of the final collapse meant that local governments had completely dissolved, leaving civilian populations entirely on their own to survive the incoming tide. Military commanders on the ground were forced to make rapid, unilateral decisions regarding the populations under their control, often with little guidance from higher headquarters. Many American officers simply ignored the local civilians, viewing their plight as an unavoidable consequence of total defeat, or a secondary issue to be handled by military government detachments later. Roadblocks had to be cleared, bridges needed to be thrown over rivers, and the column could never stall for individual tragedies. The sheer volume of destruction made it easy for passing units to develop a protective numbness to the sights of grief along the wayside. But on this particular stretch of road, near the Bavarian border, the standard procedure of driving past was about to be halted by a mother who refused to be ignored. Captain Vance walked toward the edge of the rubble pile, his polished boots kicking up puffs of gray masonry dust. The military policeman was still holding the sobbing woman by her forearm, trying to pull her back toward the ditch. Vance signaled for his interpreter, a young corporal, with a clipboard, to step forward. "Get this civilian off the roadway," Vance said. The corporal spoke to the woman in rapid German, but she broke away from the policeman and fell to her knees, pointing her bleeding fingers at a collapsed timber beam. She screamed, her voice cracking with exhaustion. The interpreter turned back to the captain, his face turning pale. "Sir, she says her son is under that collapsed wall," the interpreter said. Vance pulled out his silver-plated cigarette case and tapped a cigarette against the metal container. He looked down at the pile of shattered concrete blocks, blocking the path of the approaching tanks. "He is a German soldier," Vance said. The woman seemed to understand his tone, crying out again, and grabbing the captain by the hem of his field jacket. The interpreter listened to her frantic words, nodding slowly before addressing Vance again. "She says he is only 17, sir," the interpreter said. "He was conscripted 2 weeks ago and got trapped when our bombers hit the town square this morning. She says he is still breathing under the staircase pocket." Vance unhooked his jacket from her grip and took a slow drag from his cigarette, looking down at his wristwatch. The lead tanks of the column were already rounding the bend a quarter-mile back, their diesel engines rumbling through the valley. "We are not a rescue squad for the Wehrmacht," Vance said. "My orders are to clear this road for the Third Army advance, not to dig out the enemy." The interpreter hesitated, looking at the woman's raw, skinless fingertips. "Captain, she has been digging alone since dawn," the corporal said. "The rest of the town fled. There is no one else to help her." Vance looked at the heavy bulldozer idling by the side of the road and gestured toward the operator. "Move her into the field," Vance said. "If the boy is under there, he is a casualty of war. We have a timeline to meet, and I will not stall a whole armored division for a German uniform." The military policeman grabbed the woman's shoulders again, but she fought back with feral strength, biting his hand and throwing herself back onto the sharp rocks. She began to tear at the stones again, her blood leaving red smears on the gray limestone. The argument between the engineering officer and the screaming mother filled the narrow street, completely blocking the path just as the lead vehicle of the command convoy ground to a halt. Patton's jeep pulled up to the rubble pile, the vehicle coming to a sudden halt in the cloud of masonry dust. The general stepped out unannounced, his uniform immaculate, the 4 stars glittering on his helmet under the pale spring sun. The ivory-handled revolvers rested against his belt as he walked directly toward the engineering officer. Every soldier in the vicinity froze, the military policeman immediately snapping a rigid salute, while the heavy bulldozer engine idle seemed to drop to a quiet murmur. Patton did not raise his voice, but his presence completely consumed the narrow, ruined street. He looked at the bleeding hands of the kneeling German woman, then turned his cold gaze onto the captain. "What is happening here?" Patton asked. "Sir, this civilian is blocking our primary supply route," Vance said. "Why is she digging in the dirt?" Patton asked. "She claims her son is trapped under that collapsed wall," Vance said. "Is the boy alive?" Patton asked. "She believes so, but he is a German soldier," Vance said. Patton studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching out until the only sound was the woman's low, ragged breathing against the stones. The general did not shift his stance, keeping his arms crossed over his chest as he let his words land with absolute clarity. "You see a uniform on a piece of paper, but I see a human being trapped under 3 tons of European stone. You tell me that your timeline is too precious to stop for a casualty of war, yet you have spent 20 minutes arguing with a civilian, while my tanks sit idling in the mud behind you. Every mother from Virginia to Berlin prays the same prayer when the bombs start falling on their homes. They do not look at the color of the cloth or the insignia on the collar when their children are screaming in the dark. This woman has been tearing her own flesh apart since dawn because she is a mother, and that boy is her son. We did not cross the Atlantic Ocean to wage war against desperate women or to run our bulldozers over the bodies of children. You have a choice right now. Get a squad on that rubble and start digging alongside her. Or I will find an engineering officer who knows the difference between a military victory and blind butchery. Decide now. Vance swallowed hard, his face turning completely red under his helmet. As he looked from the general to the bleeding fingers of the woman, he realized there was no negotiation, no alternative, and no room for hesitation under that four-star gaze. The captain dropped his cigarette into the dust, turned toward his idling platoon, and motioned for the men to grab their shovels. 12 American engineers moved into the rubble with heavy iron crowbars and pickaxes. Working right alongside the bleeding German woman, the heavy diesel bulldozer was shut down, leaving only the metallic strike of steel against stone echoing through the ruined square. For 2 hours, the soldiers pried away massive blocks of limestone and shattered pine rafters, their olive-drab uniforms quickly turning white with mortar dust. The local woman did not stop, her raw fingers moving smaller stones out of the way as the men hoisted the heavier debris. Civilians from nearby cellars poked their heads out of the wreckage, watching in absolute silence as the enemy army slung their rifles over their backs to dig. Deep beneath a collapsed oak staircase, the squad found a small, reinforced pocket of space. They pulled away the final layer of lath and plaster, revealing the mud-covered face of the 17-year-old boy. He was shivering, dehydrated, and cradling a badly fractured right leg, his oversized gray Wehrmacht tunic torn to shreds. As the heavy hands of American engineers lifted him out into the sunlight, the boy shrank back in terror, expecting a bullet. Instead, a medic wrapped a wool blanket around his chest and carefully laid him onto a canvas stretcher. Frau Hoffmann collapsed onto the dirt beside him, weeping as she held his uninjured hand, while the entire engineering platoon stood back, watching the quiet reunion in the dust. Frau Elise Hoffmann remained in Würzburg after the guns fell silent, rebuilding her life from the very cellar where her son had been trapped. Her son survived his injuries, learned to walk without a limp by the summer of 1946, and eventually took over the family bakery. She lived to see her grandchildren grow up in a peaceful Germany, passing away quietly in her sleep in the winter of 1982. She never forgot the taste of the white dust or the sight of the giant American general standing in the rubble, and she kept a small piece of the limestone rock on her mantle for the rest of her days. Captain Arthur Vance continued his service through the occupation period, but his perspective on civilian administration was permanently altered by those 2 hours in the mud. He returned to Columbus, Ohio, in the winter of 1945 and resumed his career as a civil engineer, designing public bridges and roads across the state. He never spoke about his encounter with the commanding general to his colleagues or his neighbors, preferring to keep the memory of the bleeding woman locked away. He died quietly at his home in 1994, leaving behind a private journal that contained only a single reference to the day he was ordered to drop his cigarette and dig. General George S. Patton never recorded the incident in his official diaries, nor did he include it in his public reports to headquarters. He mentioned the encounter only once in a private letter written to his wife, Beatrice, a few days before the final German surrender. He wrote that a mother's hands look exactly the same, whether they are digging in the soil of Georgia or the ruins of Bavaria. Some historians have argued that Patton's decision to halt an entire armored column for a single civilian rescue was an irresponsible breach of tactical discipline during a critical offensive. They claim that an operational commander cannot afford to let personal sentiment interfere with the rigid timeline of total war. Others have argued the opposite, suggesting that this display of unexpected mercy was a calculated act of psychological warfare that completely disarmed local resistance far better than artillery fire. What is certain is that the story survived as a permanent testament to the fact that even the most brutal campaigns of the European theater could not entirely crush the fundamental laws of human nature. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have driven past to maintain the armored column's momentum? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.